is recording now.
Okay, right, I'll make a start. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation, for the introduction, and also for the technical assistance there today. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today about my research. Today I will be talking to you about the research that I've done on online abuse and gender-based violence. The recommendations that I've made for as a result of my study. I'll then spend some time looking at online abuse as a global issue, before finishing off with a brief update really of the current policy landscape, of which there have been quite a few changes recently. So my research then, it was my doctoral research, investigated the online abuse that was directed at women in public-facing occupations, resulting as a course of their work. It's a feminist mixed method study, very much coming from the theoretical framework that online abuse is yet another manifestation of gender-based violence caused by structural inequality. And so therefore there were 50 semi-structured interviews with women, because it was seen as a gendered issue. Men weren't included in the study, but with women in the public sphere, both in the UK, the USA and the EU. I also undertook the qualitative analysis of 3 Twitter storms, which are spikes in online activity, using the Twitter application programming interface, or API, to examine the content of that online abuse. Something which is now no longer possible due to changes in the ownership of Twitter since Elon Musk took over Twitter and named it X, which I will not really be using in this presentation. He's actually withdrawn the use of the free API to academics. So the findings that I came up with then, primarily the online abuse consists of 7 elements. Those 7 elements are belittlement, criticism of appearance, emotional harm, harassment, silencing, threat, and defamation. And the reason that that is emboldened and underlined is that defamation is the element that is new from my research. It's not been identified as a persistent factor before. So just to reiterate, what my research discovered was that both through looking at text of tweets themselves and talking to women, at least one of these 7 elements occurs in every single episode of online abuse. I also discovered that abuse differs by occupation, with politicians and journalists more likely to receive violent or sexualized threats, police officers more likely to receive abuse that targets their age or appearance, and, you know, maybe unsurprisingly, academics receive both. And I've given on the slide, on the side of the slide there, an example. These are genuine tweets sent to a politician, a police officer, and an academic. I also discovered that abuse occurs everywhere. So, as you can see from the examples, the experiences of women were remarkably similar, irrespective of their geographical location. So, one of my contributors based in the UK said, I was genuinely fearful about going on the train, fearful of walking my dog, fearful of going to events. Social media had made me feel unwanted in my hometown. From a participant, an academic in the EU, who said, I've had threats that say we have private password information, protected information, and we will be hacking your accounts unless you do X. X was frequently give me a job, give me a resume, give me a recommendation. And lastly, someone from the US who said, I got some criticism online saying that my work was a horrible waste of money and suggesting that I would use the funding I got irresponsibly. Again, that's an example from an academic. And the reason why that is so damaging, not only personally but professionally, is that you need to interact with social media in order to get exposure for your research, in order to gain tenure. So it directly impacts upon your employment experience. I also discovered that abuse comes from everywhere. There was evidence of women being targeted from perpetrators from across the globe. So the examples here given on the slide give examples of pile-ons from men's rights groups, racist and far-right groups, and these cause jurisdictional issues for policing when women do report their abuse to law enforcement, because they say there is nothing they can do if your perpetrator is based in a different country, for example. My research revealed that online abuse, therefore, is damaging, preventing women's advancement across the public sphere. It is dangerous both to the individual and to institutions. It's driven by misogyny. Abuse is highly gendered, and it ultimately poses a democratic threat. And at first you may feel that claim is somewhat overblown, but I would argue that it stops women taking positions of power and importance and acting confidently within those roles. When it came to the recommendations of my research, I came up with 3 dimensions of policy change. I would argue that at an individual level, where there is a great need for increased digital literacy, not just in schools, but also at university and in the workplace, potentially through things like CPD and online training, so that women know what it is, that the abuse that they're likely to face and what they can do about it in terms of filters or reporting mechanisms. At an organisational level, I would argue that there is a great need for policy change and greater support from employers. And lastly, at a structural level, we need structural change in society, which will challenge misogyny from the outset. So when we map this then to the UK context, it's useful to think about the different spheres in which online abuse is talked about and dealt with. When we think about legislation, the Online Safety Act was finally passed about 6 weeks ago in October 2023. It was delayed and altered many times following various government changes. In academia, we do have a greater awareness of online abuse, but there's a little unified approach. We frequently will provide training, but there are no policies, or there's policy but no training, no idea of what to do if an academic, for example, finds themselves under attack online. In the media, we do still see occasional coverage of online abuse, but this has now shifted, I would argue, and become mainly in relation to children, which, whilst important, kind of ignores a bigger problem. And in the private sector, we've seen obviously the change in ownership of Twitter, which I mentioned at the outset, and a move away from, I would argue, ideas around self-regulation, which were very popular about 3 or 4 years ago. So I'd like to move now to take a more global view, so widening out from my own research. First, by sharing some examples of different laws and policies around online abuse and regulation in different countries. I think online abuse requires a global response because we're dealing with huge multinational corporations, we're dealing with different policy and different cultural contexts. Pervasive misogyny works in tandem with different gender inequalities in different countries, and it's generated different legislative and policy responses, some of which would be classed as regulation and some censorship, and that's a very fine line, as we'll see. So when we look at global approaches to regulation, first of all, we saw the UK Online Safety Act, which was first introduced as a bill in 2019. Finally, as I say, came into law about 6 weeks ago. We then have in the EU the Digital Services Act, which was passed in 2022 and comes into law in all EU countries on the 1st of January 2024, promising to provide a truly European governance system involving regulation of content, rules for social media companies to follow that are broader than existing laws and underpinned by a series of fines, but obviously the UK will no longer be part of that. In Kenya, the regulation introduced in 2019, which is led by a data protection commissioner, has been described by Amnesty International as putting data governance and social media regulation in Kenya ahead of both Europe and the USA, including strict rules on social media companies, including the removal of content. In Australia, the legislation introduced in 2021 has been designed to guarantee better online safety, and it bills itself as providing the world's first legislation to tackle adult cyber abuse with specific provisions on violence against women aged over 18. And lastly, in New Zealand, the New Zealand government launched a public consultation in June 2023, which closed on the 31st of July. It's designed to review all laws around media platforms in order to provide a safer online environment. The consultation document made specific reference to misogynistic online abuse, and the draft legislation has been expected in early 2024. However, we now have a new government, and as you may have seen in the last couple of days, they seem to be willing, that new government seems to be willing to change promised and expected legislation. So I think the jury's still out on that one, really. Lastly, in Brazil, the Brazilian Senator Alessandro Vieira introduced a fake news bill in May 2020, with the aim of providing a more secure legal framework to deal with disinformation spread in the digital platforms following the election of Bolsonaro. Now, the bill should create the Brazilian law on freedom, responsibility and transparency on the internet, which popularly was called the fake news law. However, after long discussion in the chamber, the bill has an uncertain future as it still has to be voted on, and the 2022 general election changed the composition of the National Congress. Nevertheless, irrespective of its actual approval and future enforcement, the bill already serves to illustrate how public policy in one of the most important markets for digital platforms is reacting to their perceived dominance and harmful effects. So in summary then, this very brief overview confirms that there are many things happening, but it's all on a piecemeal basis and without an agreed approach. Moreover, the tech lobby in the USA is becoming increasingly more powerful. There's a move away from self-regulation, as I've mentioned, and that power is undermining any legislative or regulatory approach that is proposed by government as soon as it emerges. Before Joe Biden became president, he produced one paper in the course of his election campaign which talked about regulation of the online space in the US. But we've not seen that as the change in social media governance has happened since his election. So it's worth remembering, however, that the flip side of regulation to outlaw online harms is the equal threat posed by the different forms of global censorship, where online access is restricted, curtailed, or monitored, placing different groups, including women, in danger for exercising their online rights and freedoms. And I think it's important to remember what a fine line this is. These countries that I've indicated are those which have the most, I would argue, draconian rules on the use of the online space. So moving back to the UK now, it's worth just giving, I think, a summary of the Online Safety Act, and I have to keep remembering that it's no longer the Online Safety Bill after saying that for the last 4 years, to just bring you up to date where we are. So on the 11th of October 2017, the Culture Secretary, Karen Bradley, announced plans to make Britain the safest place in the world to be online. We have had 6, if I remember rightly, 6 culture secretaries and 4 prime ministers since that statement was made. The white paper, the Online Safety Bill, was introduced in 2019. It included policies to stop online racist and misogynistic abuse, with formal regulation to be undertaken by Ofcom. The Online Safety Act was finally passed into legislation at the end of October this year. The legislation is weaker in relation to harms to adults. So things like the plan to impose criminal sanctions on tech executives whose platforms enabled misogynistic abuse, for example, have disappeared. And the new law only addresses illegal harms, which I would argue, you know, it's always been illegal, for example, to make a death threat against somebody, whether you do that online or whether you do it by post or whether you do it in person. So we don't gain anything from that. There's also, it's important to note that the Online Safety Act, as it is now, makes minimal mention of women, girls, or violence against women. Until the second to last amendment, the word women was not mentioned at all. I would argue that given as the new act focuses entirely on children in terms of its legislation, that really the 18th birthday present we're giving to our daughters is not a good one. In terms of recent changes, as I've said, the Online Safety Act, that's the big one at the moment. We're all kind of, those of us in this area are looking to see how that's going to impact in reality. We know that it's significantly weaker than originally planned. Everyone seems to agree that regulation via Ofcom is a good idea. However, the draft guidance on protecting women and girls is not expected until the spring of 2025. Twitter is obviously now X and run by Elon Musk. One of the first things he did was introduce paid for verification, or the blue tick. What that did, which wasn't much spoken about, was actually remove an awful lot of the filters and protective mechanisms that were put in place for people like women politicians, for example. So that's meaning that those protections are no longer there. And it's also, as I've said, ended free access to academics for the API data. So to do the project that I did, which was about 10 million tweets, collected over in real time in a 6-month period, would cost hundreds of thousands of pounds now to undertake. And lastly, as I've indicated, particularly in the US, we're seeing a shift away from regulation due to a change in the political mood. So looking forwards then, for the UK, as I've said, we know that the regulation of the online space will be taking place via Ofcom. The remit of the new legislation covers things like child exploitation, terrorism, illegal weapon sales, and the illegal drug trade. So it's going to be huge. The draft regulations published by Ofcom some 4 weeks ago currently stand at over 1,000 pages. The funding of social media companies themselves remains an issue. One of the big issues when I did my research was that Twitter had no money. So whilst they were willing to do things to make the platform safer, there was no money. We're now in a situation where Twitter have got a lot more money, but there doesn't seem to be the will to make things safer. But at the same time, we're seeing continued growth in the use of online platforms throughout social policy organisations and the wider public sphere. Ultimately, however, women remain unsupported in the face of online abuse. So what this means then for criminal justice and social policy, I would argue that the online environment remains toxic. We know that there is a growing awareness of the issue and the impact on offending. So the role of technology in coercive control, for example, is becoming more well known, it's becoming talked about, but the impact on women acting professionally is less well known. The window of opportunity for regulation for tighter controls appears to have passed. However, the role of social media in the operation of social policy will continue to grow and remains an important part of social and professional life. I've put on the slide, which I'm sure Irene will can distribute some references there for anyone who's interested, and I'd be delighted to take questions. Thank you very much indeed.
That's excellent, Susan. Thank you so much. I will stop recording now.